Welcome, delegates, to this very brave new world of unprecedented new normal. And I want to say thank you to Wayne, and I want to say thank you to all the delegates in this new virtual convention we are in. I also want to thank Evelyn de Jesus, our Executive Vice President, who's never stopped fighting for justice and who is a COVID survivor. And I want to, as I'm making sure that I keep on washing my hands, I want to thank the iconic Dr. Loretta Johnson. I also want to thank Leah Daughtry, Reverend Daughtry, for starting us off today. These are amazing, amazing people, Leah, Wayne, Evelyn. But let me talk about Loretta for a second. Loretta started her career in 1966 as a teacher's aide in Baltimore. Today, she is the Secretary-Treasurer of the 1.7 million member American Federation of Teachers. Through it all, Loretta has fought for racial equity and a better life for our members, our community, and of course, as Leah just said before, our children. And while we will honor Loretta on her retirement with the Bayard Rustin Award later today, I couldn't speak without thanking my beloved friend, mentor, and partner, Dr. J. Since the founding of our union, the only time the AFT did not gather in person for a convention was during World War II, until now. Today, we don't face a world at war, but we do face an America in crisis. In fact, 3 crises: a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and a long overdue reckoning with the crisis of racism, all made worse by the current president. Let's start with the public health crisis, the coronavirus pandemic. The AFT started the alarm about this virus back in February. I called on the Trump administration to act with greater urgency while there was still time to prevent the spread. We asked for a proactive response for the CDC, OSHA, HHS, and the rest of the federal government to coordinate, inform, and protect the public. Yes, I did not just forget the Department of Education. We knew they would never do it. But a month later, when the gravity of the situation was clear, President Trump insisted, and I quote, "Pretty soon, it's going to be only 5 people. One day, it's like a miracle. It will disappear." President Trump's response has been chaotic and catastrophic. Instead of deploying the public health tools at his disposal, he's downplayed the threat, dismissed the advice of our nation's top scientists and public health experts, and rushed to reopen. And now he wants to stop testing and hide data about how bad the pandemic is. He tried to smear Dr. Anthony Fauci. Mr. President, attack the virus, not the people fighting the virus. And, by the way, Dr. Fauci will join us in a town hall with our members tonight, 6:45 Eastern Standard Time, Facebook Live. What's the price for President Trump's failed response? The virus is rising in 40 of the 50 states. Depression-level unemployment, family businesses going under, homelessness, hunger, and millions losing health insurance. As if that wasn't enough, this president is still trying to overturn the Affordable Care Act and strip healthcare protections, from millions of Americans with pre-existing conditions, and that's in the middle of a pandemic. As for his claim that pretty soon there'd just be 5 cases of coronavirus, more than 150,000 people have died from COVID-19 in the United States, which now has more coronavirus infections and deaths than any other country. Make no mistake, In the United States, the war against COVID-19 was lost from top down and is still being lost. This isn't for lack of dedicated health professionals, world-renowned medical institutions, or esteemed infectious disease scientists, and the AFT is honored to represent more than 200,000 of these incredible health professionals. AFT members have been on the front lines protecting, educating, feeding, and caring for others. Teachers, paraprofessionals, and professors shifted to remote instruction in a nanosecond in an incredible display of dedication and flexibility across the country. Take Michelle Bushy, who is a high school biology teacher in Saranac, New York. When she found that her students didn't have internet access, obviously, online learning didn't work. So, she spent hours each day calling students to provide alternative instruction, all the while helping her own second-grade daughter learn remotely. Sound familiar? Bus drivers and food service workers scrambled to ensure families get grab-and-go meals all across the country. Take Yolanda Fisher, a school food service manager and member of Alliance AFT in Dallas. She and her colleagues have been preparing and distributing up to 1,000 meals each day because they know without those meals, students go hungry. Social workers, juvenile justice workers, and workers in prisons braved risk because they knew that's what was called for. And again, I want to thank Wayne and all of his members for all the work they have done in those congregate care facilities throughout New York State. And then there were, and are, the nurses, the EMTs, the doctors, the orderlies, the respiratory techs, all putting their health and lives at risk, often without adequate personal protective equipment. As Jose de Jesus, a registered nurse and member of Health Professionals and Allied Employees in New Jersey said, caring for patients with COVID-19 is exhausting, frustrating, and scary, but it is our oath and our calling. I'm sure you've seen the photos of nurses resorting to protecting themselves by wearing trash bags. The calls I've had with our healthcare members have been agonizing and heartbreaking. So as Wayne said in his introduction, the AFT stepped in and I became a supply clerk. With a handful of AFT staff, we scoured the globe, and I mean the globe, for protective masks, face shields, and other PPE. And ultimately, we secured more than 50,000 face shields, 500,000 N95 respirators, and more than 1 million surgical masks to protect our frontline members. And then we sent them to our affiliates as quickly as possible, to our nurses in Washington State, who were at the epicenter early in the COVID-19 crisis, to our Ohio Nurses Association, to AFT Connecticut, PEF in New York, and across the country. And now that PPE shortages are flaring up again, we'll source more if we have to. I welcome the newfound respect America has for the extraordinary work our members do. The billboards honoring healthcare workers, and the memes of parents realizing teaching is so hard. But I mourn those we have lost. More than 200 members of our union have lost their lives to COVID-19. Jonathan Coelho was a probation officer in Danbury, Connecticut. The day he was intubated, he wrote his wife and their young children about how lucky he was to be in their lives. He died the next day, 32 years old. Gabrielle Gale was a fourth grade special ed teacher and union delegate in Queens, New York. Gabi and her husband were expecting their second child when she died. Elva Graveline was a certified nurse assistant in Connecticut. She worked in the respiratory unit, literally on the front lines when COVID hit her community. And in working to save the lives of others, she lost her own. I was blessed to cry with her family in June. We mourn them, and we remember them. At this time of so much loss, there are others we must remember, whose names we must say. Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Philando Castile, Eric Garner, George Floyd, murdered while sleeping, while jogging, while driving, because they were Black. We must confront the racism that cost them their lives, and that is one of our nation's original sins. Racial bias is not only evident in one man's knee on another man's neck, it is built into virtually every system in the United States. It's evident in underfunded schools, voter suppression, substandard housing, healthcare, and transportation, low wages and high unemployment, discriminatory policing, and mass incarceration. And in racial health disparities that existed long before COVID-19 started taking Black and brown lives at much higher rates than for white people. Higher infant mortality, more premature deaths, more exposure to unsafe water, unhealthy air, and the environmental conditions that cause asthma. Let's face the truth. Many Black Americans have been struggling to breathe long before the murders of Eric Garner and George Floyd. Donald Trump did not invent racial injustice, but he has fanned the flames of prejudice and made the divisions in our country much, much worse. The Muslim ban, the border wall, calling white supremacists very fine people, and blaming Chinese people for COVID-19. This is a moment of reckoning that requires all of us to act. And act so many of us have. The diversity of those who have protested and taken action gives me hope that America can shed the shameful indifference to the value of Black lives. And they give us proof that progress is possible. From the cities that have banned the use of chokeholds by police, to changes in the use of force guidelines, to the adoption of duty to intervene rules, we're seeing some long overdue progress in policing. That's necessary, but not nearly sufficient. We must protect the right that underpins every other, the right to vote. We must secure justice for the most vulnerable, whether it's a trans teenager or the countless Native American families for whom extreme inequality is part of their everyday existence. Children should never be caged. Families belong together, and Dreamers' home is here. The AFT is trying to do our part. Our Executive Council passed a resolution in June laying out 19 commitments to combat systemic racism and violence against Black people. It calls for the separation of school safety from police departments and help for school staff to address the needs of children who suffer racial trauma. We'll convene a nationwide conversation on how to transform school security, led by longtime leader from the UFT, Leroy Barr. We're continuing the work of the AFT Latino Task Force, and we are creating the AFT Asian and Pacific Islander Task Force. And anti-racism training will be part of all AFT leadership training. In the labor movement, we often talk about turning moments into transformative movements. We must transform America, as Langston Hughes wrote, into the land that never has been yet, and yet must be, the land where every man is free. Free to walk the streets, free to jog, to drive, to learn, without fear and with true equality. The pandemic has exacerbated another pre-existing condition in America, extreme income inequality. Even before the pandemic hit, 78% of Americans were living paycheck to paycheck. 40% of Americans couldn't cover a $400 emergency. 30 million children relied on school meals. 20% of the country's 43 million federal student loan borrowers were in default. And then COVID hit. As this pandemic batters the United States, we are all in the same storm, but we are far from being in the same boat. Since COVID erupted, 45 million Americans lost their jobs. 1.5 million more children are going hungry. And the billionaires? U.S. billionaires added $584 billion to their own wealth. 1 in 5 workers is either on unemployment or waiting for their claim to be approved, and those benefits will run out in 2 days. State and local budgets are cratering. Almost 1 million people who work in schools and colleges have already lost their jobs in this recession, and 1.4 million more educators will lose their jobs if the Senate continues to refuse states and schools the funds they need for essential services. Donald Trump desperately wanted to stake his presidency on a strong economy, but history will show that this downturn was so much worse than it needed to be, and that so many more people lost their jobs because Donald Trump is so bad at his. Americans get this. The majority believe the country is on the wrong track and that we must do better. Just like the New Deal and the Great Society, we know that bold action is needed to achieve the economy and society that we have long championed. A society in which people have the opportunity to attain a better life, good jobs with a living wage and a union, adequate health care and housing, child care and retirement, a healthy and sustainable environment, and justice for all. And that starts with education, pre-K through post-secondary. And our public schools, which are a foundation of our democracy, must be excellent for all, equitable for all, and empowering for all. But first, they must reopen safely. We know that kids need in-person learning and that remote instruction is no substitute for it, but it has to be safe. That's why the AFT has been planning for school buildings to reopen since they closed. Back in April, we issued our plan to safely reopen America's schools and communities. It's based on science and public health protocols, as well as educator, school staff, and healthcare expertise. Our plan details 3 conditions essential for school buildings to reopen. First, low infection rates and adequate testing in any region where in-school learning is being considered. To state the obvious, we cannot rebuild the economy, including reopening schools, until we get the virus under control. Second, public health safeguards, starting with masks and social distancing, cleaning and ventilation, hand washing, and reasonable accommodations for those at risk. And third, I can't believe I have to say this, the necessary resources to enact each and every one of these safeguards, as well as the supports for meeting kids' academic, social, and emotional needs. And because states have been so badly hit, federal resources are absolutely essential. And parents, students, school staff, and their unions have to be involved, not sidelined. While safety must be the main consideration, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to school reopening. Public schools in Montana have reopened with the necessary spacing and other safeguards. But that's not possible in places where COVID is surging. That's why school districts like those in Atlanta, Houston, and Los Angeles have been forced to make the difficult decision to start schools remotely. But in Florida, despite the state's surging COVID infection rates, the governor is ordering all public schools to fully reopen in August. So, last week, with our help, the Florida Education Association filed a lawsuit against Governor DeSantis. The right wing predictably lashed out at teachers and their unions, claiming we don't want to be back in work. It's just ridiculous. Not a word about the resources or conditions we need, or Trump's mishandling of the crisis, or all the work we're doing across the country to plan for a safe return. In New York City, for example, the United Federation of Teachers has negotiated an agreement on a package of protocols, including PPE, medical accommodations for staff, social distancing, cleaning, disinfecting, and scheduling for blended instruction. And there's a new push for community schools and wraparound services all throughout New York State. Unions in Massachusetts advocated for a phased reopening that starts with school staff having time together to prepare for the resumption of schools. And the state has just agreed to that. Then educators and school staff checking in with students and families to assess their basic needs would happen next, including the basic needs of emotional health. And then third, resuming instructing and learning, whether in person, remote, or hybrid. I don't know how many times I have to say this. School districts are immobilized by lack of funding and lack of space, by windows that don't open and bathrooms without soap. The average school will need at least $1.2 million, or $2,300 per student, to open its doors safely. Assuming no other budget cuts, that's at least $116 billion to have the resources to protect the health of students, staff, and families, to have the supports to meet every child where they are, and to advance every child's learning and development. But of course, in this recession, there have been budget cuts, draconian cuts. So in this recession, the only source for that funding is the federal government. The House of Representatives did its job. They passed the HEROES Act in May, that COVID relief and recovery package, which included $1 trillion for states and localities, including $100 billion for K-12 public schools, higher education, and HBCUs, and $50 billion for childcare. It shores up health care from Medicaid to preventing the closure of more rural hospitals, and it requires OSHA to do its job. The HEROES Act also defends the right to vote, extends unemployment insurance, and protects renters and homeowners from eviction. What did Mitch McConnell do? He scoffed at the aid state needs. He said states should go bankrupt. Then, as parents and teachers around the country were grappling with how to start school in the fall, McConnell went on vacation. These funds should have been distributed to communities months ago. How dare Mitch McConnell stonewall and stall this aid? And how dare President Trump tweet, in all caps, schools must open in the fall, with no plan, no funding, and no idea what he's talking about? The hypocrisy of canceling the GOP convention in Jacksonville, Florida, because of the risks to GOP delegates gathering in that Florida hotspot, yet in the same breath demanding that children and teachers gather in schools in that same hotspot. Why would anyone trust President Trump with reopening schools when he has mishandled everything else about the coronavirus? Why would anyone trust Betsy DeVos, who has zero credibility about how public schools actually work? Why would anyone try to reopen schools through force and threats without a plan and without resources? Unless all they wanted was to create chaos so it would fail. Before the virus's resurgence, and before Trump and DeVos's reckless open or else threats, 76% of AFT members polled in June said they were comfortable returning to school buildings if the proper safeguards were in place. Now, they're angry and afraid. Many are quitting, retiring, or writing their wills. Parents are afraid and angry too. A recent AP poll shows that the majority of Americans think that school buildings should only reopen with major adjustments or revert to remote instruction. 90% say that. Let's be clear. Just as we have done with our healthcare workers, we will fight on all fronts for the safety of students and their educators. But if the authorities don't protect the safety and health of those we represent and those we serve, as our Executive Council voted last week, nothing is off the table. That advocacy or protests, negotiations, grievances, or lawsuits, or if necessary and authorized by a local union, as a last resort, safety strikes. It's the 11th hour. We need the resources now. Our message has gotten through, but we haven't gotten what we need. Members like you have made calls and sent letters to your senators, tens and thousands of them. We can't let up now. Keep calling, keep writing. If the federal government, the one to which we pay taxes, can send a life raft to the cruise industry, give hedge funds a free lunch, and offer a tidy handout to Kanye and the Kushner family, they sure as hell can help working families and help educators ensure our kids get the education they need. As the coronavirus has affected us, as our country confronts these three generation-defining crises, a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and a crisis of racial justice, one factor, one person is making them all worse: Donald J. Trump. Donald Trump told us who he is. In the first moments of his presidency, he spoke of American carnage. He intended it as an insult to his predecessor, but it turns out to have been a prediction. He caged children and tore families apart. He tear-gassed peaceful protesters for a photo op and sent federal forces to Portland, uninvited, to incite violence. He gave Vladimir Putin a pass for putting bounties on American troops. As the economy slumps and COVID death spikes, President Trump has chosen to be the commander-in-chief of a culture war, not the consoler-in-chief to a nation in pain. He called peaceful protesters calling for racial justice terrorists. He denies the fact that Confederate symbols and statues celebrate slavery and racial terror. He ranted that, and I quote, "Our children are taught in school to hate their own country." Do you recognize his dystopian portrayal of America? Of the public schools where you foster the freedom to think, to hope, and to learn? Of course not, because this is just another of the 20,000 documented lies that have come out of Trump's mouth since he's became president. It's no wonder that a majority of Americans say Trump's handling of his job as president has been irresponsible, self-absorbed, chaotic, unprepared, and out of control. It's no wonder that historians are sounding the alarm about the threat he poses to democracy. How many scholars do we need to tell us that when you lose democracy, it's gone? How much history do we need to learn to know it can repeat itself? Democracy is on the ballot. It's not enough just to defeat Donald Trump. We must write the course of our country and reimagine a better, more equitable future. Of course, that's what we try to do as a union. Just this year, we've helped AFT members reduce their student debt by millions of dollars. We've provided a new trauma benefit, and we're offering Innovation Fund grants to help members teach in a changed environment. We'll do our part. But we need partners on school boards, in state houses, and in the White House. And Joe Biden will be a true partner. Before the pandemic, the 2020 election was about the soul of our country. Now, it's about our soul, our safety, our freedoms, our economic future, justice, and a whole lot more. Our presidential endorsement process this cycle was designed to engage more of our members than ever before. And it did. And after all the member town halls and listening sessions with the candidates, when it's time to come together, the AFT Executive Council gave Joe Biden a rousing endorsement because he is the experienced and caring leader our country needs right now. We got a choice between two people and two visions for America that couldn't be more different. Joe Biden is deeply decent, and when he's made mistakes, he's learned and grown from them. He is honest. In every dealing we've had, his word has been his bond. In fact, as I've said before, he was our go-to person in the Obama administration. He gets things done. President Obama looked to Vice President Biden on everything from taking on gun violence to foreign policy. As Vice President, he helped fight a national health crisis and climb out of recession, and as President, he'll do it again. But there's something else that really matters at this moment, and that's Joe Biden's deeply felt empathy. At this time when we're experiencing tragedy upon tragedy, we need a president who understands and cares about what we're going through. Few public servants have endured so many of life's most heartbreaking losses, the loss of a wife and 2 children. Even fewer have found purpose in that pain by easing the pain of others. That's what he does. Decent, honest, caring, effective. Any of those words apply to the current occupant of the Oval Office? Joe shows us how you put one foot in front of the other, not to run away from the past, but to keep moving towards the future. And what does that future look like? Imagine a world with Universal pre-K, debt forgiveness for educators, triple Title I, expanded community schools, supports with kids with special needs, high-stakes testing thrown out the window, charter school accountability, public colleges and universities tuition-free for families who earn less than $125,000. That's not from an AFT resolution, although it could be. That's straight from the Democratic Party platform born out of the Bernie Joe Unity Task Force recommendations we helped draft. That platform, including its embrace of labor unions, its plans to revitalize American manufacturing and rebuilding our aging infrastructure, health care as a right, its commitment to creating a path for citizenship for 11 million people, eliminating greenhouse gas emissions, reversing the Trump tax cuts, and ending mass incarceration is, as Bernie Sanders has said, the most progressive Democratic platform in history. It's a plan to build back better and reimagine what society should look like. It's time to give Joe Biden the chance to enact that plan as president with a teacher, Dr. Jill Biden, at his side. And we will need a Senate on his side and ours as well. Without it, Mitch McConnell will keep throwing sand in the gears of government and packing the courts with judges driven by ideology, not the rule of law. Okay, you're saying, right now the polls look good for Biden. People recognize that President Trump has failed our country, and we're competing in Senate races across the country. But the only poll that counts is the election result. And we can't just win. We need to win decisively. We know votes will get suppressed. There will be broken machines, closed precincts, and voter roll purges. We know more disinformation campaigns will be unleashed. And does anyone doubt that Donald Trump will do everything he can to hold on to power? We need to win and win decisively. Democracy is on the ballot. In 2 of the last 5 presidential elections, the candidate who won the popular vote didn't become America's president. We can't let that happen now. So, just like in 2018, when we made such inroads in states and in the House of Representatives, we need to win the presidency, take back the Senate, and win local elections from judges and DAs to state legislatures and school boards. This is our shot to make real change, and we are not throwing away our shot. Okay, spoiler alert, Lin-Manuel Miranda and Joe Biden will be with us on Thursday. AFT members have already made thousands of calls during the primaries to get out the vote. That's great, but more is needed. This has been an era of disinformation, lies, and a dangerous erosion of trust. But guess what? You are trusted by your family, your friends, and your community, and your fellow union members and colleagues. Nothing cuts through that information like the people you can trust. So, we need to do what our union has done for a century. Yes, it may be remote, but it's person-to-person organizing. We're aiming for 100,000 actions a month, phone calls, texts, and emails. We need every hand on deck, and to help, we've created a new program and the tools to help us get this done in this pandemic. Go to go.aft.org/action to see it right now. Let me give you an example. We lost Michigan by 10,000 votes in the last presidential election. Our members showed up. In 2016, 82% of our members were registered to vote and 73% voted. But some of the folks we are closest to did not. Changing outcomes like that is within our grasp. If even half our members inspired just one of their family or friends to vote, that outcome would have changed. We need you to come out. We need you to tap your circle, your book group, your sorority, your Facebook friends, your peeps, anyone that you know you can get to the polls or to vote by mail. And speaking of voting by mail, it's safe. Don't believe what Donald Trump tells you. After all, he voted by mail, and you better believe he wants to have his vote counted. This November 3rd, we need to vote like our lives depend on it, because they do. In the last 2 years, we've learned a lesson over and over that the founders of the AFT understood, that John Lewis and other leaders of the civil rights movement understood. Activism and elections build the power necessary to create a better life, a voice at work, and in our democracy. Activism changes the narrative, elections change policy, and together they change lives. I spoke earlier about finding hope in the protests for Black lives. I find hope in something else too. You and our activism, your activism and the union's activism. From the moment Donald Trump was elected, to his choice of Betsy DeVos, to the Janus decision, to school shootings, austerity, and countless other challenges, AFT members have stood up for what is right. We saw it in the teacher strikes from the hollers of West Virginia to the alleys of Chicago and during the rainstorms of Los Angeles. We saw it in the bus tours in Florida and New York, the demonstrations in Minnesota and Massachusetts, in Michigan and New Mexico, calling on officials to fund our future. We engage community, and together we change the narrative about public education, we change policy, and we change lives. The other side knows the power of collective action. That's why they go after us. It's no mystery why Betsy DeVos sat in on oral arguments in the Janus and the Espinoza Supreme Court cases. She knows that public education and the right to join a union empower people. And she knows that when people are empowered, even her billions of dollars won't be a match for our millions of voices. We know it too, that together we can accomplish things that are impossible on our own. That's why people are joining the AFT. We've organized 59 new units with close to 12,000 workers in 21 states since the last convention. And since the Janus decision, the AFT has seen a net growth of more than 44,000 members, including 4,000 new members since the start of COVID. I am hopeful, despite everything we're going through. There is a basic goodness in the souls of Americans. We must have leadership that matches that goodness. Together, we can temper the health, economic, and racial justice crises that are tearing our community apart. Together, we can rethink, reimagine, and rebuild our country. Together, we have the power to defeat Donald Trump and elect Joe Biden. Together, we will care, fight, show up, and vote for a better life for all Americans. Thank you.